to this video presentation on a comparison of the Gospels, this one focusing on the disciples portrayed in the Gospels. The disciples are really an important part of studying the Gospels because really they are the embodiment of the people who will interact with Jesus. And they're the people who, probably more than any others, we see as the people who Jesus is bouncing his ideas off of as he's teaching them. So since so much of the gospel is about teaching parables to someone, it's often the disciples. If it's about healing, usually the disciples are there in the process and having a role to play in it. So they aren't people who should be ignored. It's important to understand, first of all, that really the term disciple refers to them being learners, that to be a disciple is to be a learner. It's often depicted as follower, and while follower isn't wrong, it doesn't mean just somebody who tags along behind somebody, but actually somebody who is supposed to be learning from someone. And how Jesus gathered his disciples is important because it tells us a lot about what he expected of them and what role he saw them being. So it also tells us who would be the followers of Jesus, who is suitable to be a follower of Jesus, both at that time and now. So let's take a look at the different Gospels. It's interesting to note a couple of things. When you look at the Gospel of Mark, for example, as you go through all of the Gospel stories, the disciples play a very active role in participating in the miracles of Jesus. It's interesting to note that for as many of the miracles as they perform, they don't do forgiveness. They can heal, but only Jesus can grant forgiveness. Only Jesus performs acts of forgiveness. Often the disciples are depicted as, in a somewhat negative tone, as people who just don't understand. They just can't quite get it. And it doesn't matter how many times Jesus talks to them. It doesn't matter how many times he explains. They just don't understand. He has to consistently reiterate to them, and it just doesn't work. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it really does draw the audience into the story, because all of us, we have this tendency when you're looking at something, say, from the perspective of an inside joke. When you're in a room with two different people, and those two people have an inside joke between the two of them, and they understand what they mean by it, you're kind of left out, and you're in the dark about it because you don't need to know, because they get it. So it really wouldn't work from Mark's perspective to have the disciples get it and not have to have stuff explained to them. Having to have Jesus explain stuff to them is the mechanism through which we are pulled into the story. So like the joke that somebody else doesn't quite get and has to have it explained to them, you're standing in the room and you can go, aha, I get it, and I follow along as well. So it really does serve a useful purpose, and probably wasn't necessarily intended to be such a negative portrayal of the disciples. When you compare that to the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, it has them struggle to get it as well, but Matthew, portraying Jesus to be the excellent teacher that he is, has them struggle to get it, but he continues to teach them a little bit more. He tells them parables, and when they don't understand, he explains it in another way, illuminates it a little bit, and then they begin to get it. And it's this part of welcoming the audience to come and participate in that process of growing in their understanding, especially when it comes to the parables. When we're talking about, from Matthew's perspective, the kingdom of heaven, it can be difficult to understand. And the disciples are a vehicle by which Matthew tries to bring us along and participate in the process of growing in our understanding as we're learning from Jesus the teacher the same way the disciples did. There are a lot of examples in Matthew. We see the big focus being on not just knowing the law, not just being a good person who can speak the law, who knows the law, who memorizes the law, but being somebody who knows how to live the law properly. That's what Jesus is doing when he's being a teacher. He doesn't just want disciples who will follow him. He doesn't want just disciples who get it. He wants to teach them how to live the law. And that's really what he expects when you have a disciple. That's truly following Jesus. So the disciples in Luke are a little bit more personalized yet. especially when you get to Peter. Peter gets heavily featured, almost to the point of being kind of like another main character at times. It becomes a story about Peter's life. Note that Jesus calls Peter to be a disciple first, and then Andrew in the Gospel of Luke, only in the Gospel of Luke. And it has this more positive portrayal of disciples who get it. Even when you look at, say, for example, in the praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, they have in Matthew and Mark the disciples who just don't get it, and they keep falling asleep. Whereas in Luke, he sort of gently rebukes them the one time, acknowledges that that this is taxing because they have fallen asleep because of their grief. And then moves right along after that. He doesn't chastise them for it. And it really gets to this idea of the worthiness of the disciples. The disciples are all common people. In all three of these Gospels so far, you have them they're not the respected, high-up people. Jesus didn't pull from the scholars, from the keepers of the law, from the aristocrats of the time period, the great learned men. He drew from the people who were the marginalized in society, the fishermen, the tax collectors, the people who didn't have the pedigree, because it really demonstrated that all were worthy to follow, all were worthy to learn from Jesus. And in fact, the people who really didn't know anything and didn't have these firm beliefs that they held on to, if anything, were maybe even more worthy because they had more potential to learn from Jesus than the people who refused to learn because they thought they knew it all already. Then you have the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John has, unlike Luke, where Peter sometimes takes a little bit more of a backseat in the story, to the disciple who Jesus loved. And the disciple who Jesus loved is an unknown figure, kind of a cryptic phrase. Many see it as a way of John the Evangelist, as symbolizing the whole of Christian community, or being the embodiment of the ideal disciple, really being a way of putting yourself in the story. I would even say, you could go as far as to say, put yourself in the place of the disciple who Jesus loved and ask how that changes the story for you, to say, what happens if I'm being put in that story as being the quintessential follower of Jesus? What does that mean for me? And John, as a general rule, individualizes and personalizes the disciples much more overall. Whereas in the synoptics, they may say sometimes the disciples did this or the disciples did that. John is far more likely to say Philip did this, Nathaniel did that, James did this. And it really brings home this idea that these are human people. They have identities. They're real people, because we're supposed to associate them with them. And there's a different call for the disciples in this case. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have Jesus approach the fishermen in the Sea of Galilee, and there's this sense of the unworthiness of them, but they come and they follow after his call. Luke even has the great draft of fishes, where you'll see Peter prostrate himself and say, "I'm not worthy to follow you," but Jesus calls him anyway. And that almost kind of gets mirrored in John at the very end of the story, when we have the great draft of fishes kind of on the other end after Jesus' resurrection. And it's not the only time you see an example of a different kind of finale, where John tacks on a little bit of a coda to the end that draws a close to the disciples. Another great example of that would be how you have Jesus Jesus predicts the denial, Peter's denial of him 3 times. And that happens in all of the Gospels, where Peter denies him. But in John, he gets that chance for redemption, where he can come back and say, "Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Do you love me? Yes, I love you." And has that redeeming part at the end of it, about believing and being loved and having life. And so that's very interesting, to have those different stories and different portrayals. And we have to ask ourselves, probably the chief question in all that is, what does that mean for us as we are disciples? What does it really mean to be a follower of Jesus? So thank you very much for attending this presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.